Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're going to get started in just a couple seconds. Folks are still filing in from the waiting room, but excited to have so many of you here already for our event this morning. And excited to see some familiar names among the attendees. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, say where you're joining from. Yeah, happy to have you do that. But yeah, let's get started. My name's Alberto Medina. I am the president of Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora. And we're really excited as an organization. I'm excited personally to be hosting this conversation, this book event with Steve Howell, author of Cold War Puerto Rico, Anti-Communism in Washington's Caribbean Colony. Um, Before we get into it, I want to say a little bit about our organization, BUDPR as we call it, and why we do this work. Many of you may be familiar with us if you've ended up here today, but just in case you're not, Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, which translates to Puerto Ricans United in the Diaspora, is the only national organization here in the United States that engages in direct political advocacy for Puerto Rico's decolonization and independence. That is our issue. That is our main priority is to fight for our nation's freedom. We do that in a few different ways. Direct political advocacy, as I mentioned. We engage with lawmakers, we engage with candidates for office to put Puerto Rico's colonial status on the table as an issue to push them to support independence. And when they're in Congress to advocate for legislation that can advance a real, serious, inclusive decolonization and liberation process for Puerto Rico. We're also organizing the Puerto Rican diaspora here in the United States, which is nearly 6 million strong. We are, I believe, a sleeping giant in many ways that can have extraordinary power in U.S. politics on this issue. And so we work to empower our own community to take up this issue, to engage in advocacy, to have a say and to have an impact in here where we are, voters and constituents. And then a bigger part of our work and what we're doing here today is education. As we know, and as Steve and I were just talking about before we got started, so much about Puerto Rico's political status, about colonialism, about our own history, is still in the shadows, is still hidden and unknown from our own people, certainly, but from the U.S. public that should also know what they have done, right? What the U.S. government has done and continues to do to Puerto Rico. So through our content, through thought leadership, writing, podcasts, etc., and through events like this, both virtual and in person, we seek to bring that history to light, to talk about what U.S. colonialism is still doing to Puerto Rico in the present, as part of that struggle and that advocacy for independence. So that's what we're doing here today, and that's why we're so excited to be joined by Steve, the author of this great new book, literally published just in the last couple of months. And I'll make sure that folks know where they can find the book at the end of the talk today. But let me introduce Steve quickly. Steve Howell, he's a journalist and author, a former communications consultant. He's been a political commentator in places like the BBC, ITB, Sky News, various podcasts. He has written frequently for publications like The Nation, The Guardian. He's the author of several books, both fiction and nonfiction, which I didn't know about the novels until I started reading a little more. But we're here to talk about his latest book, Cold War Puerto Rico, that really examines this history, and in many ways the dissonance between the way that the United States paints itself as a fully democratic regime and the imperial reality of the way that it has dealt with its biggest colony, not its only one, of course, but its biggest colony, Puerto Rico. So, without further ado, Steve, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start with this question. Can you briefly tell us sort of your story and your family story, I know, and the story of how you ended up writing this book? And if you don't mind me putting it bluntly, how does an old white guy in the UK end up writing about political persecution in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, how indeed. Well, I'll try not to kind of make the story too convoluted, but it is a little bit convoluted, so bear with me. But yes, I was born and grew up in Britain. My father was born in New York and grew up in California. Was a graduate of UC Berkeley in 1939, and it was the height of the New Deal, where progressive politics, although he came from a conservative family, there was a progressive atmosphere, and I think he was influenced by that. And he joined a group of, he was an architect graduate, and he joined a group of progressive architects and planners in San Francisco called Telesis, who had big ideas about how cities should be planned. And as it happens, and this is how he ended up in Puerto Rico, Rexford Tugwell visited an exhibition that Telesis mounted in San Francisco, and was very impressed by their ideas. My father, meantime, went off to Chile, where he worked in an architect's office in Chile, went off to Chile with his first wife, and became a fluent Spanish speaker. And so when Tugwell was appointed governor of Puerto Rico by Roosevelt, he was looking around for people to hire to work in a planning board that he wanted to set up. And through an intermediary, he contacted my father and asked my father to go and work in Puerto Rico. So that's how it came about that my father arrived in Puerto Rico towards the end of 1941. But by that time, he'd encountered the Communist Party in Chile and become friendly with a journalist called Diego Munoz in Chile. The name is significant in that Diego Munoz was then the name that, or one of the names that my father used to sign his cartoons in labor and progressive and communist publications in Puerto Rico. So he went to Puerto Rico with his first wife, took up this job, but in his evenings and his weekends, he was involved with the politics that was going on. And this was, during the war, there was an upsurge in sentiment in Puerto Rico in favor of independence. The US had signed the Atlantic Charter, which declared that nations should have self-determination at the end of the war. But of course, what they were thinking about was Britain's colonies, not their own colonies, of course. Anyway, my father stayed in Puerto Rico until 1948, when he and his first wife went to study at LSE. And it was at LSE that he met my mother. And he then went back to the US to get a divorce, intending to bring my mother to the US. But the political climate had changed so dramatically that he decided to see if he could get a job in Britain, and ended up getting a job at Liverpool University. Now, when I was growing up, I was aware that he'd lived in Puerto Rico, and he would talk about it, and he talked about the people he knew, and would often quote Cesar Andre, who some of you will know as a leading Marxist in Puerto Rico, and who was leader of the Communist Party at the time my father was there. And Nico Andre, I see, has joined us on the call. So hi, Nico. So Nico is Cesar's son, and Nico has played a big part in the story behind this book, by the way. So when my father died in 1987, I discovered boxes and boxes of books and pamphlets and letters and articles and reports and all sorts of stuff about Puerto Rico in boxes in the loft in the house. And as you know, was fascinated by this. But having a young family myself and a job and so on, it took me a long time to get around to actually doing anything much about it. But I started researching seriously in 2012. And I made contact, first of all, with Nico's sister, Layla, and then with Nico. And they both helped me. I, around the same time, submitted freedom of information to get access to my father's FBI file. I had a battle getting hold of the files, and some of them, it turned out, had been destroyed. And what I got, a lot of it was redacted. But what was very clear was that My father was an FBI. I mean, I got 600 pages altogether, and it was very, very clear that it was all about Puerto Rico. And it was very clear that my father was an FBI target because of his involvement in politics in Puerto Rico. And he remained an FBI target and under surveillance via British intelligence services while he was in Britain right up until the late 60s. Um, and it made me realize that there was, there was something further to investigate here. And what I also realized, having, been in contact with Nico and Layla, was that Cesar Andre and Jane Speed, Nico's mother, Cesar's wife, and other communist leaders had been, I realized how badly they had been harassed and persecuted in the 1950s after my father had left. And that became really the main story as far as I was concerned, because as I looked at the literature about McCarthyism and about the FBI and Hoover, I realized that Puerto Rico was just completely invisible in all those books. I mean, it sometimes got a passing reference, but nobody had written up the story of the leadership of the Puerto Rican Communist Party being indicted under the Smith Act, even though books have been written about the leadership of the US Communist Party being indicted under the Smith Act. So I felt that there was an important gap in the history. And I gradually discovered other things like the story of the HUAC hearings uh, in San Juan in 1959, and then the use of COINTELPRO in Puerto Rico even before it was used against the civil rights movement in the United States. So I realized there was a story to tell, and I wanted to try and bring that to fruition in a book, which I'm very glad I have, and I hope it's useful.
Yeah, we're very glad you have too, because again, so many of these stories, individual stories that I think are important to talk about just the impact of this persecution on people, right? But also on movements and on what has happened to Puerto Rico and what is still happening to Puerto Rico. And sort of to get into that history a little bit, your book is focused on anti-communist persecution, right? And the Smith Act and HUAC and all these things you're talking about. Obviously, that intersected, quite a bit with the Puerto Rican independence movement. You've already mentioned the PCP, the Puerto Rican Communist Party. But can you talk about how those two movements, were connected and perhaps conflated, by the FBI, both for better because there was real solidarity, right, and real conflict as well, but then also for worse because of how it caused the Puerto Rican independence movement then to be targeted.
Mm. Well, it's as these political stories often are. It's very complex, and there's lots of different personalities involved with their own kind of unique positions on things and rivalries between different political figures and so on. But there was underneath that there was a degree of overlap and cooperation between the different political figures in the three main components, if you like, of the movement: the nationalists, the Puerto Rican Independence Party, which was formed in 1947-48, and the Puerto Rican Communist Party, which had, although it's the smaller of the three parties, had quite a bit of influence in the Puerto Rican labor movement, the trade unions. And there's a fair amount of overlap. So, for example, when Pedro Albizu Campos came back to Puerto Rico in 1947, of course, after being imprisoned for quite a few years in the States, there's a big welcoming rally for him. And Cesar Andre spoke at that rally, as did a representative from PIP. So there was that sort of degree of kind of we're in this together. But then the following year, when the elections took place, the first elections took place for a governor, the nationalists took the position of boycotting those elections, whereas PIP participated. Um, and you could understand the arguments both ways. I mean, the nationalists were arguing that this was a con, giving us. I'm not saying when I say that they argued it was a con, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but they were not impressed by the idea of just it was a sop, the idea of it just Puerto Rico had just been given a chance to elect a governor who had only limited powers. And then, more seriously, in 1950, when the nationalists mounted their revolt, the PIP and the PCP knew nothing about it and were taken by surprise, as were many people. And as a result, the nationalists were relatively isolated, and it was possible for the forces of the US forces to suppress the revolt fairly quickly. But then, when they had suppressed the revolt, of course, they rounded everybody up. They rounded not just the nationalists, but also the PIP leadership and the PCP leadership and countless other people who just simply expressed sympathy for it. In fact, although they released the leaders of the PCP, one of their members, Desde Marrero, was kept in prison under the gag law. And I've dedicated my book to him because it was a particularly sad case of someone he hadn't been involved in the revolt. The evidence against him amounted to him having been heard singing songs favoring independence and saying things that implied support for the revolt, like today I feel truly proud to be Puerto Rican. So on the strength of that, he was convicted and imprisoned under the gag law, and he was kept in prison for nearly a year and a half, even though, and he was an active member of the PCP. Until eventually Cesar and others negotiated a reduction in his bail and he was released. And then eventually, on his appeal, his conviction was overturned because there was actually no real evidence that he'd done anything other than sing a song. But sadly, in his case, it broke him. I mean, while he was in prison, his wife committed suicide. He was a broken man when he came out. He ended up in a mental health hospital and he ended up living on the streets for the rest of his life. So it's a truly tragic case of somebody against whom they really had no evidence of any violence whatsoever. So there was this conflation as you mentioned, of the different groups, regardless of their differences over tactics. Um, and and there was also this overarching use of anti-communism to smear all of them. And so after the shooting in Congress in 1954, the March 1954 shooting in Congress, the Lolita Lebron and the others were accused of being communist dupes, even though they were not communists, and the Communist Party had absolutely nothing to do with that particular act. And immediately in the aftermath of that, both the nationalists, dozens of nationalists were arrested, but also the leadership of the Communist Party were arrested. Now, the case collapsed because there was no evidence against them, but they were both targeted, and the whole thing was dressed up in anti-communist rhetoric to kind of smear all of them and to divide the independence movement.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think in many ways, um, so many of us who are still doing this work of advocating for independence are still we're mostly not getting thrown in jail anymore, which is good, but that conflation and those smears continue. I mean, go on our organization's sort of comments on social media at any given time, and half of them is just commie, being called a communist, and it remains a very effective smear, unfortunately,
Mm.
in Puerto Rican politics, which has the root in these moments, and of course, in, as you mentioned, in real connections, right? But also in the fact that it was a real tactic, and in many ways an effective tactic to smear the independence movement, um, to denounce, our leaders. And I want to say before I continue, I forgot to say at the beginning, we will be taking audience questions. We have the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar. Please put your questions there, or put them in the chat if it's easier. We'll get to those at the end, after I ask Steve a few more questions. But you've started talking about this a little bit. Somebody, obviously, in your father's case, cartoons, right? You just spoke about someone who just literally for saying or singing something was tossed in jail. And this shows really what we've learned about this history of persecution in the past few decades, and especially once the COINTELPRO and other FBI files were declassified, that this surveillance and repression that was supposed to be focused on violent subversives, right? That was what was on paper at least. Really was much broader, and it targeted artists and teachers and students and community leaders, everyday citizens. You know, obviously you've just mentioned one example, but I wonder if you could speak a little more about just how wide a net the U.S. government cast in going after people.
Well, I think it was very wide, and I think it's also important to remember that most of the leaders of the pro-independence parties were themselves just regular people. I mean, they were, the movement wasn't so big that it could afford to have full-time professional politicians. Most of them were, had day jobs and had to earn a living somehow. After Cesar and Jane Speed were arrested with the other communists in March 1954. They went and lived in the in the rural area and just lived from farming essentially for a while. Um, and Cesar went on to earn a living as a journalist. So even the prominent leaders of these groups had to earn a living outside of politics by and large. I mean, some were trade union officials. I've posted on my Facebook page, which is, by the way, SBH Author, and you could share it on your Facebook page. I've posted an example of a guy who was only very loosely. I don't know if he was ever a communist, but he was certainly, if he was, only loosely associated with the Communist Party, a guy called Alfredo Ortiz Aponte, whose file I got as part of the FOIA for my father's file. And I think it's an interesting little example because the FBI started to investigate him in 1958 for as a possible witness to be subpoenaed in front of HUAC. And two FBI agents turned up at his workplace to kind of interview him. And I don't know if he was working as a planning technician for the planning board in Puerto Rico in 1958, and they were questioning him about things that had happened in 1940 when he'd been member of a cooperative that was run by a communist. They questioned him about a letter that they claim he sent my father, which I don't think my father ever received. But he sent it to my grandmother's address, and this was the kind of stuff that the FBI were interrogating this poor guy about. And he never, as far as I know, held any kind of leadership position in the Communist Party. I'm not even sure if he was ever actually a member himself, but just on the strength of him being friendly with communists. So on the one hand, you had the leading people like Cesar and others and Jane and Juan Santos Rivera, etc., who were arrested multiple times through the 1950s and imprisoned for periods. In some cases, not Cesar, but a couple of the other communist leaders were imprisoned for as long as 10 months because their bail was set so high. Uh, there was a problem raising the money for their bail, even though at this point they were just on remand. They hadn't been convicted of anything. Um, so you had those people who were, sort of seriously persecuted, if you like, and incarcerated, and who were later hauled before HUAC. And then you had the sort of hinterland of other people who were, in one way or another, bullied or harassed. And I think in all this there is the kind of fear factor that deterred people from political activity. The idea of the FBI knocking on your door was enough to put people off, and that was very prevalent throughout this period, and for some time, I mean, much longer after it as well.
Yeah, and it's a great segue to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is precisely about that. What impact did this have on these political movements in Puerto Rico. I mean, we know the Communist Party of Puerto Rico, I think maybe technically exists, right? But it's not really a player anymore. The Independence Party is, but as many of us, know, the Independence Party until very recently, became sort of um, a Green Party-esque, third party getting a very small, percentage of the vote. And that led to a lot of people saying, well, look, and still saying, well, look, there's just hasn't never been any support for independence in Puerto Rico,
Mm.
right? So all you independence folks, I don't know what you are talking about, like the people aren't with you. And it seems like part of the answer to that question that arises from your book, and of course from a lot that we now know about this history is, well, there has been historically support for independence, but a lot of those people were persecuted and silenced, and we've see the impact of that. So yeah, so what impact did this all have? Do you believe in weakening organizations, parties, movements, both for independence specifically, right? But also just kind of broader leftism and progressivism in Puerto Rico, which is just now, I think, starting to recover.
What I would say is that as an outsider looking at this, because I started off as an outsider, I feel a bit like an insider now. Hopefully, an insider, not an intruder. Um, but what I would say is, when I started looking at this, and I was aware of the fact that this Commonwealth status had been adopted in the early 1950s. But when I started really looking at it closely, I, as an objective outsider, I had to say it was one of the biggest stitch ups I've ever seen, in the sense that there was, in 1950, it was put to a vote as to whether or not to have a constituent assembly. Now, people who wanted statehood thought, well, that's perhaps a step in the right direction. That's better than what we've got already. People who supported Munoz Marin, some of them believed in independence and thought, well, maybe this is a stepping stone towards independence. I mean, people who supported the PPD at that point weren't all, but they weren't anti-independence. They just didn't feel it was realistic in those circumstances at that time. But they thought that the setting up of a constituent assembly would lead to something that was a stepping stone to independence. That's how it was perceived and presented. And then when it came back, the constitution was written up. Um, it was endorsed in those terms. There was a big boycott. If you look at the figures, it was not overwhelmingly supported by any means, but it was accepted. And then it goes to Washington, and Congress takes out the heart and soul of that Constitution, which was the Bill of Rights that was in it, takes that out, says we're not having that, and sends it back. So even what people voted for wasn't what they ended up getting. And yet that status still applies today. And it's very difficult once and all of that was going on whilst the gag law was taking place. While the gag law arrests were, taking place, and people were being, in prison, or they were on trial. And then subsequent to it happening, you then had the Smith Act prosecutions, against the communist leadership. Now, any objective outsider looking at all of this would say, if you were saying, does it pass the test under UN standards of a free and fair decision by the people of Puerto Rico on whether they want independence or not? I don't think anyone objectively would say it ticks the boxes. I mean, the US got it through the UN in 1953, I think it was. In a vote where there were, quite a few abstentions, and a lot of the colonial, it was before a lot of the colonies had gained independence. If you put that to a vote in the UN now, or in fact in the 1970s it was put to a vote in the UN, the view would be that that doesn't pass the test. So what Puerto Rico has got doesn't pass, in my opinion, any objective test of what a free and fair way of determining whether the country should have independence. I don't think Puerto Ricans were given that choice, and they were then locked into a settlement that was very difficult to get out of. And you can understand Puerto Ricans being nervous about that. I mean, especially when there are sort of threats lurking in the background, like if you have independence, you'll lose your pension, which was actually mentioned during the 1948 elections as something that might happen if Puerto Rico, if people voted for the PIP candidate for governor rather than Munoz Marin. So I think that that calls into question the whole basis of the current status. And I think the persecution and the way in which the whole thing was structured did have a big impact on what Puerto Ricans felt that they were able to do in those circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's kind of different levels of fear mongering, right? From you might get killed to you might get thrown in jail to you might lose your job or not be able to get a job, all the way down to these, economic consequences. It's sort of like a nesting doll of
Yeah,
of fear, caused by persecution and pressure and manipulation from the U.S. government, both in Puerto Rico and, as you say, up to the case that was taken to the UN, which just this past week, the case of Puerto Rico was heard at the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Our organization was there, as we always are, and the United Nations, or that committee at least, has now passed over 40 resolutions, calling for Puerto Rico's self-determination and independence. But of course, with the United States, I should say, playing the role that it plays at the UN and in the international sphere. Unfortunately, the case has not been seen by the General Assembly and by the UN more broadly. But I think um, it speaks to what you were saying, that that vote might look a lot different now than it did in in 1953. Um, I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned a couple times HUAC, which is the House Un-American Activities Committee. This was, McCarthy, right? McCarthyism, and these Smith Act prosecutions, because I also want to focus a bit on the good moments, the moments of resistance in a way, where the Puerto Rican people
mm,
actually stood up in some way to some of this harassment and repression. And when you write about this in Puerto Rico, which, first of all, I would love for you to just tell a story of kind of what actually happened and how this came about, because I think many folks don't even know that the House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings in Puerto Rico. But you say they pretty much got humiliated
yeah.
in Puerto Rico. So can you briefly sort of talk about what led to that and what happened there?
Well, this was in 1949, 59, sorry. So the Smith Act prosecutions had fallen apart in 1957, and the acquittals were in January 1958. So immediately the FBI and his allies on the House Un-American Activities Committee turned their attention to what other means they could use to kind of uh, keep Puerto Rican communists in line, as it were. And so they decided to hold hearings in San Juan, which had never happened before. And they were scheduled for November 1959. And this immediately, they subpoenaed quite a few people. A few people actually left the country, but 13 witnesses who were subpoenaed agreed to appear, or didn't leave the country so that they could avoid appearing. Let's put it that way, uh, including Cesar Andre and the other leading people in the Communist Party. But they weren't all. Well, in fact, by then Cesar was no longer in the Communist Party. In fact, so they weren't all actually officials of the Communist Party, and they were all subpoenaed. There was immediately opposition to this that went, across a broad spectrum, including um, the PIP opposed it. Gilberto Concepcion de Gracias spoke out about it. Jose Benitez, who was a Democrat who was close to Jack Kennedy, spoke out about it. There was a lobby to get Munoz Marin to intervene to stop it, but he wouldn't or didn't. And there was a legal team created by the Puerto Rican legal community to represent the 13 people who'd been subpoenaed. Um, and they came up with a innovative strategy, which was to challenge, instead of advising the subpoenaed witnesses to take the fifth, they came up with a strategy of challenging the right of HUAC to be in Puerto Rico and the jurisdiction of the committee in Puerto Rico, on the basis that Puerto Rico was supposed to be autonomous, there was supposed to be a free association, it was supposed to be government by consent. What was HUAC doing here? What business did it have in San Juan? That was the essence of their position. And they put Jose and excuse my Spanish pronunciation, I keep stuttering, Enamorado Cuesta, they put him up as the first subpoenaed witness. And he had to say 46 times, I don't recognize your right to even be in Puerto Rico. And that was on the first day. Meanwhile, outside the building where the hearings were taking place, there was a huge demonstration protesting against the presence of the committee in Puerto Rico. So the hearings were over 3 days. And over those 3 days, all 13 witnesses gave exactly the same answer, time and time again. And over the 3 days, the protests grew in number. You'll see in the book, I've got an image of a press cutting that gives you an idea of the size of the protests. And on the third day, during the course of it, one of the committee members claimed that the whole thing was orchestrated by a guy called Clark Foreman, who was had come in from New York. He was the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee representative, the director, and he'd come in from New York and claimed that he was behind this innovative legal strategy. Well, of course, that just fueled the uproar because it was suggesting that Puerto Ricans weren't capable of devising a legal strategy for themselves. And at one point, the whole proceedings had to be adjourned because it was just so chaotic after the lawyers had protested about this. And this was every day, this was getting more and more press coverage in the United States, in the New York Times and in other US newspapers, that the committee was making an exhibition of itself in San Juan. And eventually on the third day, they decided to cut short their hearings and go to the beach, literally in one case, and then fly back to New York early. And Clark Foreman said afterwards that never, and he had been involved in these battles with HUAC all over the United States for years. And he said never in the 21-year history of HUAC has there been such unified and absolute resistance. And I think that's a tribute to what happened in Puerto Rico. And it's a great story. It's a great story of the McCarthy era that unfortunately has never really been properly told. I'm glad to have been able to do it now. And I think it's testament to the fact that when people unite, I mean, this goes back to the point we were sort of talking about earlier about the divisions between the nationalists and PIP and the PCP, that unfortunately at that crucial juncture in 1948 to 1952, there was that disunity between those groups who were united in wanting independence, but unable to find a way of expressing that unity. But at the end of that decade, in 1959, that unity was expressed, and that gave momentum to a resurgence of the independence movement in the 1960s.
Yeah, it's a great story. And as I was watching on the plane a couple of months ago, the Good Night and Good Luck, the Broadway play that's now been filmed with George Clooney about, McCarthy and all this stuff. And yeah, I wish there could have been a little bit in about Puerto Rico on that. Probably too much to hope for,
Well,
but what it actually,
can I
yeah,
make
yeah,
a point on that? Because I
sure.
think you mentioning that, I think highlights a very important point, which is that the there is this thing about McCarthyism that it was kind of this kind of aberration in US history. That there was this guy McCarthy who went a bit berserk. He was anti-communist for a short period. Everyone was paranoid about Russia. Everyone was paranoid about Russia having the bomb and communists and et cetera, et cetera. But it was mainly focused on Hollywood and other high-profile people were the main targets of it. But I mean, actually, McCarthyism started long before McCarthy came on the scene. The FBI opened an office in the mid 1930s in Puerto Rico. The infrastructure of what we call McCarthyism, the Smith Act, the setting up a HUAC was in 1938, the Smith Act was in 1940. All of that, the legal and political infrastructure of McCarthyism, was created before the Second World War. Um, and really, I think you can actually, if you look at the history, and I won't sort of go into it any further, but if you go back to the Palmer raids after the First World War, which Hoover was involved in, you can see a continuum right through the history since. And when I was in Washington for a book event in May, I took a walk down to the center of Washington and had a look at the Hoover Building. And why is the Hoover Building called the Hoover Building? It's called the Hoover Building because although Hoover was discredited, in theory anyway, although he was exposed for having operated completely illegally and spied on hundreds of thousands of people completely illegally, they didn't change the name of the building. The building was still named after Hoover. The FBI was never reformed. It was never reconstructed. And they carried on celebrating the people of that era who had persecuted Americans of all walks of life in all parts of the United States and in Puerto Rico.
Yeah. And well, and I think a big part of, why your book is such an important contribution too is this thing that you're talking about, of this thing starting even in the 1930s, right? And because I think for a lot of people, the persecution, especially of the independence movement, the focus is so much on COINTELPRO, which, was the FBI counterintelligence program, which in some ways was an evolution of things that were happening before, but, it was really in the sort of mid to late 50s that really kicked off. And but as you mentioned, this goes back decades earlier, and I think it's important to, especially as we try to understand, what has happened in Puerto Rico politically, that it wasn't just the 50s, not just the 60s or 70s, and I think some of the COINTEL profiles go up to the 90s. It was really the 30s and the 40s, and it's an important part of that history. Um, I want to ask one more question before we get to questions from the audience. I see one in the Q&A already, but please put any questions you have for Steve, questions about the book in the Q&A in the chat. We'll get to them. But I want to, kind of bring us to the present a little bit. Your book is about things that happened 60, 70 years ago. But it's really profoundly relevant in this moment. Puerto Rico's still a colony. Um, you know, you talk about in the book about why the United States was so insistent on keeping Puerto Rico, right, and defeating these movements because it was using Puerto Rico as a military outpost, which it now, is again in many ways. And of course, as always, as a source of economic, profit and exploitation. We also see political repression by the U.S. government, which, as you mentioned, has never quite been reformed, has never quite gone away, but is having a bit of a moment, I think, and now too, under Trump. So I wonder, as you've been sort of like living in this moment, right, thinking about what happened in Puerto Rico, what you've written about in this book, what connections have you been making between then and now, and what's happening in the U.S. and in Puerto Rico and around the world these days?
Well, I think, I mean, you mentioned the military thing, and obviously that is still very relevant today. That was that was, I think, the fundamental reason why it was so important to the United States as it was emerging from the Second World War as a global power. To if you look at a map, to think, well, Puerto Rico is there in the where the Atlantic meets the Caribbean, the access point for the Panama Canal, uh, a great place from which to intervene in Latin America. So you've got that, and then you've got Hawaii and Guam in the Pacific. Um, as a global power, you need those military bases in those key locations in order to assert your hegemony. So, and that's true today, and hence the fact that I mean, it's true today in a different form. I mean, obviously, military tactics have changed, military technology has changed, but nevertheless, Puerto Rico was used for the attack on Venezuela. And Maduro, as I understand it, passed through Puerto Rico on his way back to being incarcerated in New York. So that military thing is still very important. But the other thing that's, I think, quite striking about that period and where we are today is that in a sense what happened in Puerto Rico at that time was the beginning of what you might call a neoliberal experiment, even before anyone had talked about neoliberalism, in the sense that one of the first things um, that the PPD decided to do after Tugwell had left was to ditch the kind of New Deal model of publicly owned industries. Several publicly owned industries have been set up, um, and sort of the state, if you like, coordinating investment and development and investing in services and education and so on. So they moved away from that model to a model of tax incentives, um, with which was in due course called Operation Bootstrap. And to begin with, that yielded some benefits, although a lot of the investment that came in created jobs that were substituting jobs that already existed. But there was a net increase in jobs to begin with. So there was a feeling of, it kind of underpinned Munoz Marin's argument that there were some economic benefits that we don't want to lose by severing our links with the United States. But what's happened progressively since is that the reality of that neoliberalism has taken its course, and the model of making a place a tax haven and a sort of paradise for effectively external investment is that more and more of the wealth you create is then extracted from your economy. So Puerto Rico now has this big gap, and it was a big and growing gap from the 1960s onwards, between its gross domestic product and the amount of income that is retained in the island by Puerto Ricans. And that gap has, increased to over 30% and has been over 30% now most years since the 1980s. And so one of the calculations I give in the conclusion to the book, which I admit, I mean, I can back it up and it is referenced, but I admit that I haven't got a spreadsheet for it, but I could definitely prove it, is that using that model, the US has extracted $1 trillion worth of surplus value from Puerto Rico in interest, in rent, in profits over this period since the 1980s. In today's money, $1 trillion worth, and therefore the amount of debt Puerto Rico's got, which was used as an excuse to override even the limited autonomy that Puerto Rico was given in 1952. The amount of debt it's actually got is a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of value that's been extracted from Puerto Ricans. And I think that's a big part of the message that I'd like people to take from the book, that this settlement has led to that situation, and that people shouldn't be fearful of independence, because actually the Puerto Rican economy has generated a lot of wealth. It's just Puerto Ricans haven't had the benefit of it.
Yeah, and a great point. And as I can add a little bit as someone who was doing research for my own book on Puerto Rican independence, which will be out next year. There was a 2022 study that looked at this acutely, not just in Puerto Rico's case, but in the case of other sort of like, tax havens actually Ireland, a little closer to you, as you know, I'm sure is
Mm.
another place with or is another place with a big GDP to GNP ratio, as they call it. But this study, calculated that the foreign firms, and foreign in this case includes the United States, operating in Puerto Rico, have a profit to wage ratio of 1,600%. So that means for every dollar in wages earned by Puerto Rican workers, those firms earn over $16 in profits. So
Right.
16 to 1. So, it speaks to what you're talking about. The wealth gets created. It's just that very
Yes.
little of it actually stays, in Puerto Rico for the benefit of Puerto Ricans. Um, but I wanna take a couple of questions before we wrap up. A question here from Adria Quiñones, who asked a great question that I always like to ask too. What was kind of one of the biggest surprises in your research as you went through this? What's something that really sort of struck you? And I'm sure you might have mentioned a few things already, but something maybe you haven't talked about that you went really like, oh wow, this is really, really striking and surprising to me.
Trust. Hello, Adria and Toby. I, I, I know Adria, and I should have anticipated that she'd ask me a difficult question. But uh, so much of it was surprising. It's hard to sort of put my finger on any one thing. But I think some of the COINTELPRO stuff, which I haven't really spoken about, is pretty surprising. The sort of lengths to which they went in the 1960s to disrupt and destabilize the various independent groups and try to divide them against each other. I knew a fair amount about. I mean, this is another classic thing that I knew a fair amount about COINTELPRO as it affected the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, the way in which the FBI used blackmail against Martin Luther King and so on, how they'd used against the Black Panthers and the peace movement in the United States. But I was really surprised to find that Puerto Rico was actually COINTELPRO was deployed in Puerto Rico before it was deployed against the civil rights movement, only by about 6 months. But when it was first devised as a way of disrupting and trying to finish off the US Communist Party in 1956, but it was applied to Puerto Rico. They just took that decision in August 1960. And it was not until December 1960 they decided also to use it against the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. So no one anywhere, I think, has highlighted the fact that Puerto Rico was the first, outside of the CPUSA, was the first place where COINTELPRO was used. And I think that says something again about the importance that the US attached to defeating the independence movement in Puerto Rico. It was more of a priority than the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
even more of a priority.
No, absolutely. And I think some of these dirty tricks that people know were used against Martin Luther King, like, calls and letters to there's files basically where FBI agents in Puerto Rico are writing for permission to do these things to leaders in the the Puerto Rican independence movement. Um, all right, a couple of questions in the chat too, and I think, yeah, maybe we can get to a few of them in just a few minutes that we have left. Maricel asks, first thanking us for the fascinating conversation. Wondering if there's any more connections you could make between kind of this era, Tugwell, the Cold War, and what happened in Vieques later. And I'll say quickly, I think one connection that I heard as you were talking is this idea of not recognizing, U.S. authority or jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, which was part of the strategy used by the Puerto Rican independence leaders in the fight in Vieques. When they were arrested, many of them refused to sort of recognize that the federal government had, jurisdiction. And of course, in this case, they were thrown in jail anyway. But yeah, I wonder if the those are other connections that you've made in terms of that fight to get Vieques out of Puerto Rico, or to get the Navy out of Vieques.
Well, I mean, the connection between, I'm not sure if I completely have got the question, but I certainly think that it's an important to connect the Tugwell era to the what's happened to Vieques, because the clearance of people from Vieques was occurring in the early 1940s on Tugwell's watch. And I think this also highlights the role of the US military, in the sense that the it was a bit of a law unto itself. Tugwell may have been the governor. I'm not saying he was blameless, but he was to some extent powerless to stop the US military doing what they were doing. They were building the Roosevelt Air Base, and they were taking over Vieques. And all of that was happening while Tugwell was governor. Um, I mean, it's a bigger discussion about Tugwell. I mean, he's a mixed figure. In some ways, you can say he did some good things, but in other ways, he set the scene for what we now, what we now have in Puerto Rico, which is that I mean, he accepted that it was strategically vital to the United States, and he encouraged Munoz Marin's strategy of staying within the framework of the United States. I'm not sure
Absolutely.
if I've answered the question, but there is certainly a connection between Tugwell and Vieques, that's for sure, which I
Yeah, no,
touch on in
thank
the book, but don't go into any
yeah.
great depth.
Yes, and again, when we'll give Steve a chance to tell us where to find the book in just a few minutes as we wrap up. But let's try to get to a few more questions, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Professor Arcadio Diaz Quiñones, who's in the chat asking a bit of a deep cut question historically, I think, for folks who may not know some of these figures, but he's asking if you could tell us a little bit about the role of solidarity and alliances in 1948, the Henry Wallace campaign, and figures like José Luis González and Vito Marcantonio.
Well, it is an important part of the story. Um, the Wallace campaign, for those who don't know, Wallace was had been Roosevelt's vice president, and he was increasingly squeezed out as. I mean, he wasn't his vice president for Roosevelt's final term, um, and it was increasingly sort of squeezed out as the Democrats moved rightward. And then he stood as an independent in 1948. But there was a lot of enthusiastic support for Wallace in the Puerto Rican community in New York. And Jose Luis Gonzalez, who Arcadio mentions there, who is the writer who was a close friend of my father's, also a close friend of Cesar Andre. He was very active. He was very young at that point. I think he was only in his early 20s, but he was very active in New York in mobilizing support for the Wallace campaign. And the Wallace uh, movement was the first, it was the first political party to call for Puerto Rican independence. And that was a significant part of its program in the 1948 election. Now, Wallace, I think, um, won about just under 2 million votes, if memory serves me correctly. But he did get a pretty big vote in New York, and that was thanks to the mobilizing that was going on there, in which Jesus Colon and Jose Luis Gonzalez and others played a big role. And you mentioned the member of Congress, Mark Antinio. He he was also an important player in that whole process. So there was a sort of, whilst things were going on in Puerto Rico going in the wrong direction, if you like, there was this actually very positive movement going on in New York and in the United States, and it would be good to see that. It would be good to see that again in the context of the movement that's now emerging in Puerto Rico in favor of independence again.
Yeah, and Vito Marcantonio, still talked about in Puerto Rico as one of the few allies that the independence
Yeah,
movement has had
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
Congress. Hopefully, we're getting to a place where we'll have a few more, but and I
yeah.
think one of the few probably self-described communists who has been in Congress. So well, I know we're at time. I want to get to just a couple of more questions about kind of what's next. What do we do? Give people hopefully some more hope, kind of as we did with talking about the HUAC hearings. But I do want to give you a chance in case people have to hop off to tell folks where to find the book before we get to those final questions, because it's a great book. People should read it. People should buy it. So please tell people where to grab it.
Well, it's available from the publisher, which is the University of Massachusetts Press, on their website. It's available on Amazon, and it's available through, independent bookstores, local bookstores. You can order it relatively easily. I've got it on my website as well, and I'm selling it at a discount because I'm passing on my author's discount. So if you want to order it there, you're welcome to do so. Um, so more or less anywhere, really, it's readily available. I'm sorry to say it's not cheap. It's $34 and something, I think. Um, but I didn't have any say in the price, I'm afraid. So it is what it is.
Yeah, and I've put a couple of links in the chat to the UMass Press website, to your website, and well worth every penny. So yeah, I hope folks will pick it up, and then yeah, I want to end with, and maybe I'll combine these two questions, one from the chat and one for the Q&A, as a kind of what do we do now question, right? I think Michael Collazo had asked in the Q&A, do you think there's any lessons for the Puerto Rican independence movement on the island now, especially as you think about how so many of these folks organized, were able to raise resources to succeed in some small ways, even despite the surveillance and the repression and the limitations. And then I know Brianna Johnson in the chat was asking, what do you see as useful strategies to move this issue forward, especially, perhaps in the international arena? Is the United Nations a useful place to try to decolonize Puerto Rico, especially with, given U.S. influence, kind of how can we move forward, for those of us in the independence movement, what lessons do you think arise from all this history?
I think one big
Not an
lesson
easy
is
question, by the way.
not an easy question, though, but I think one big part of that is something that Cesar Andre was arguing at the time, and I think it's even more applicable today, which is the independence movement has to integrate the economic argument into the political argument. The two things have to go together. There has to be a vision of the fact that Puerto Rico could prosper as an independent entity. And the only reason why there's any argument about that is because the colonial power is threatening to effectively punish Puerto Rico for independence, which it shouldn't be allowed to do. But there's no reason in reality why Puerto Rico couldn't flourish as an independent entity. Um, if it was able to trade and work with all the countries of the world freely and was able to get investment from any source, and was also to be compensated for the abuse of its resources by the United States properly. Has the US military, ever paid anything like the real value for its abuse of the Roosevelt Road site and the Vieques and so on. So I think the economic argument is very important in the political struggle, to show that people really have a stake in this, and to avoid the fear factor. Um, and the other thing I would stress is just this question of unity. That I've been involved in politics for decades here in Britain, and it is amazing how people manage to find ways to kind of get divided, because it's always happening and it's always very frustrating. But the lesson of this history, I think, is very clear that in periods where the independence forces have been united in spite of destabilization and covert action, um, those periods have seen great successes in the 1960s, leading up to the ending of military activity in Sulebra, for example. So I think that message of unity is very important. Um, and the other thing I would say about strategies, I mean, I can understand people being a bit cynical about the United Nations, but it is still an important forum for expressing sentiment internationally. But also, there are other channels through which countries in the global south are now working together. And I think it's important that the Puerto Rican independence movement connects with those countries and cultivates their support and solidarity. You know, particularly countries like Mexico. Spain has taken a progressive stance lately in distancing itself from the United States. South Africa is a leading voice in the global South and is, often taking a progressive stance. So, I think it's important that those connections are made so that the Puerto Rican independence movement doesn't feel that it hasn't. I mean, it needs that international solidarity, given Puerto Rico is a small country. It needs that support.
Well, I think that is a great note to end on. Thank you to all our attendees and to you, Steve, for spending a few more minutes with us. Again, pick up the book Cold War Puerto Rico, and on Steve's website, on the UMass Press website, on Amazon, wherever books are sold and you manage to find it. This is as people have been saying in the chat, this is it's history. It's a fascinating history. As we talked about, it's also ongoing history, right? It's an ever-present issue for Puerto Rico, and again, I think that's why it's so valuable that you wrote this book, Steve, and that we got to have this conversation. Um, for folks who I'm going to put one more link in the chat, and it's the link to our organization, Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora. If you enjoy events like this one, conversations like this one, please go on there, join our list if you're not on it yet. If you can support with a donation, that's always movements also need money. Um, and
Yeah.
and we're trying to do a lot of this work here in the United States. We were just at the United Nations for the sixth year in a row. So from here, from the diaspora, those of us who are here, we're trying to be part of that movement that builds a lot of those connections that Steve is talking about. But yes, thanks to everyone for joining us. Steve, I'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And if anyone out there wants to ask any follow-up questions, the best way to do it at the moment is probably through Facebook. I'm on there, SBH author, and you'll find quite a bit of stuff about Puerto Rico on my feed there. Unfortunately, my X account has been hacked and is completely out of action. So don't go there because it's got loads of posts about uh, SpaceX and Elon Musk. God
Yeah.
knows how. Anyway, but I'm always happy to hear from people. And I would be very grateful. One small request I'd have is if you've read the book already, and when you do read the book, I'd be grateful if you could post reviews of it as well on Amazon and Goodreads, because that always helps get other people interested. So that'd be great if you could do that. But all the best to your organization, uh, Alberto. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Absolutely, Steve. Well, thank you. It's been great to be in touch with you over the last few months too, and definitely not an intruder in our movement, an ally and a friend, and we're glad to have you. So, with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks again, everybody. Hopefully, we'll see you soon. We'll chat with Steve more at some point, and have a good rest of your Saturday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.